Now, there are a million micro brands out there, but I've never covered Traska, and I've seen their watches all over the place because of their scratch resistance. Now, this one is their GMT because I love chronographs and GMTs. This one is also a little unique in that the dial is different than what you're going to find out of their typical Venturer. Now, after spending some serious time with it, I have to say that this has some really great features, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that affordable GMT watches are everywhere, especially with this spec package. It's just a totally different ballgame than it was a couple years ago. Now let's start first with the standout feature of this watch, and that has to be the dial. And it sounds very Kevin O'Leary, but the real Meteorite dial that they have on here has got this natural pattern to it. And obviously there's a unique nature of the fact that because it's a Meteorite, no two dials are going to be identical. They're going to look pretty similar, but they won't be identical. And I think that that's always something that's really unique and cool about Meteorite dials. That being said, typically that's very expensive on the luxury end to buy something with a Meteorite dial. It's usually a point where manufacturers can ask for a lot more. Traska is looking at basically an increase of $230 from their standard model. So standard model is $735. This one is $965. And what's really cool about this has to be that texture. Now, I would compare it honestly here to my Grand Seiko, this winter edition, where the texture is somewhat similar, the color is somewhat similar. You know, all these things kind of look very much the same from one to the other. Price point, obviously very, very different. Dials is something that I've definitely been more and more attracted to over the time. Now, you're obviously going to notice, especially I'll continue the comparison a little bit, you'll notice that they're not identical in their other features, right? For, again, $1,000 versus something like $7,000, you're going to miss the applied indices and all their facets that you get with something like a Zaratsu polished indice set that is then pressed onto a dial like this. This is going to be your standard indices. Now, they're very reflective. They stand out from this different grayish background. And then you have an internal rotating bezel on top of that. Hands are polished. They've got a couple facets for a little bit of reflection, which I think is always a nice touch. You can see with these macro shots that I really took my time because I like the look of this watch. It's one of those watches where I hold it, I put it on, I wear it for a little bit, it just makes sense. It doesn't feel like the standard watch, which is why when they asked if I wanted to look at the Meteorite version, I was really excited to take a look at it. Specs are on the screen. You're looking at a 12.5 millimeter thickness on a 38.5 millimeter watch, so relatively standard, nice everyday wearable package. 20 millimeter lug width. You've got it tapering down to 18 millimeters at the clasp. You've got a deployant clasp, really nice perlage work here on this clasp as well. And then you've got a standard, very wearable 46 millimeters lug to lug. It has here, for lack of a better word, an oyster style bracelet. Looks like solid links, seems like solid end links. You do have obviously drilled lugs and the ability to take these links out here with spring bar tool. Now there's other things here that you're obviously going to get with this watch, which is this polished sides. You got a little bit of a chamfer running alongside the case, brush tops. The logo in Traska's case is also not annoying. Some micro brands have really weird logos, and so I like the fact that this logo is subdued. The text and style of the typeface kind of fits with the logo and doesn't call too much attention to itself. It does say GMT and automatic at the bottom. Take it or leave it, up to you. They tried to match the color there of the GMT to the GMT hand, but it kind of fades away. It's really thin typeface, so you don't really notice it that often. They do have the date at the bottom. It is white background. I don't know that you could have color matched the Meteorite to the date dial. I think the white is really nice. It matches the indices. I think it's fine. I love a 6 o'clock placement of the date in general versus 3 o'clock. I think it looks a little bit more clean that way. It's very legible. Again, hyper reflective, which is always my favorite on watches where they tend to call out to you. Inside here, you have the Miyota 9075 movement, which is the traveler style GMT affordable movement that came out a couple years ago, and I was super excited about it. I remember the days when the Tudor Black Bay GMT was the only option sub like $6,000 that had a GMT movement in it that made it's slightly more affordable. And the fact that you can now get a traveler style GMT that looks like this for $1,000, I think is fantastic. And obviously you could drop down to their standard dials for $735, as I said, and that's a great package, again, for that price. Now, people give Miyota some crap because it's not Swiss made, but that is a whole other side conversation about people that are really overly obsessed with things being Swiss or not Swiss. In my opinion, the Miyota movements have been very reliable for me in the several watches that I have owned that have had Miyota movements in them. The 9075, from what I've experienced, has been great. I put these on time graphers and they've run pretty much within their spec. You can regulate them if you want to get them even closer to something you'd find that's COSC certified. But then the tech and specs that you find in different watches is something people are always going to argue. Now, I do notice a few minor points with this 9075, and that is when you change the hour hand, you do notice a little bit of a wiggle with the minute hand. Doesn't mean anything bad. It just means that torque is partially also loaded on the minute hand when things are moving. Super normal, especially again for an affordable movement like this. Historically, the Rolex 3185, which is the predecessor to the Explorer 2 that I have in there, and that ran for like 20 years, had a similar wiggle in the GMT hand. That's just something that can happen every so often. Again, you're looking at rotating one independent part on the same cannon pinion that everything else in the Motion Works is operating next to. It's very common to have a little bit of translation across to another hand, but it's not the end of the world. Still, that is something to call out. But swapping from one hour to the next is super snappy and responsive, and I have really no difference in my mind between operating this and something like my Explorer 2. Now on the left side here, you have a secondary crown, and that is your internal rotating bezel. And that is something that is entirely different. I have never owned an internally rotating bezel like this, and I think there's pros and cons for sure. The pro is that on the outside, you still have a really nice, compact, wearable case, but you still get the added functionality of a GMT watch, despite the fact that it looks more like an everyday watch than a GMT style watch. Without the external rotating bezel, it's much more subdued. I think it could dress up a lot easier than something like, again, an Explorer 2, a GMT Master, or any of the models that look similar to those. The external rotating bezel adds some heft, adds some size, and overall makes the case package required typically to be a little bit larger, more like 40 millimeters. If you like the 38 millimeter case size and you like the standard, sleek, svelte, everyday look, then having an internal rotating bezel gives you that advantage. Downside to an internal rotating bezel in this case is it's non-clickable, meaning that it just slides over from each spot to the next. There's benefits and drawbacks. The biggest drawback here is the fact that this is a screw-down crown, which means that when I rotate this, I notice that as I go to rotate it in, I have to be very sure that I'm engaging the threads, that I'm pressing down past the point where it was engaging that wheel, and then starting to screw it down. If you accidentally, as you're doing it, start to rotate that wheel again, you're gonna slightly misalign it. Again, when you're rotating in the normal crown, that's not a big deal. You just actually wound the watch a little bit as you're going to screw it down. But here you have to make sure you really press in and turn to make sure that you don't turn the wheel past where you wanted it to stop. Minor thing, but again, that's something you do need to be aware of on an internal rotating bezel. If you like the Omega Seamaster, then you probably don't mind having the crown over here. In my opinion, the crown over there isn't my favorite. I might have preferred an external rotating bezel or even a fixed steel brushed external rotating bezel, a la the Explorer 2 or the Mist Flake from Grand Seiko. Both of those I think look really nice, and I think would look really nice with this dial package as well, because it's very similar to the Grand Seiko one that I'm referencing. Still, when you get this with a little bit of reflection, it's just, I think, gorgeous. It's one of those watches that just stands out as really nice in the hand. And this is why in the metal is so important. You look at press images of this and I think it looks nice, sure, but it doesn't quite do it justice. It's the same thing that I found with this Grand Seiko here where, you look at it in press images and it looks really nice. And I will say this is substantially more reflective than the Traska still. I'm not comparing them from a finishing standpoint entirely, but it's another example of you don't quite get the depth and interest that you get with the texture and with the reflections like you do in press images. It does have a micro adjust clasp at the back, a 5-position micro adjust, where you can use this push button at the back in order to open it and close it. We've seen this starting to pop up in a lot of different watches, from San Martin all the way up through the micro brands. You'll notice that they have this while you press it, and as you press it, it clicks in, and then you push a button on the inside to release it to open it up a little bit more. It's nice to have in there. It's not a need to have, I suppose, but it's certainly a nice to have. It reminds me a lot of the same style bracelet that's on my IWC Mark 20, which also is a press in and push to release. It does have a closed case back on the back, standard case back, nothing fancy, nothing cool or to really ramble on about. Just a standard case back. I wish they'd done something a little bit more there, maybe a laser etching. They did the laser etching on the crowns. They probably could have done it on the case back with very little extra cost. Even something simple like this IWC where they've got the airplane on the back is just a nice little touch to make it seem a little nicer. Again, for the price point, I don't know that I can quite argue about it yet, but you're getting pretty close to the point where you're needing some of those features that make people feel, again, like every single detail has been thought through. They spent the time to perlage work the deployment clasp here. Probably could have done something to the case back as well. Scratch resistance that Traska talks about is obviously fantastic. I haven't tested it, nor am I going to. This goes back to them. I do not want to start scratching it like crazy or testing to scratch it. But if I can get them to lend me a link at some point in time, I'd love to look at different coatings and scratch resistances. I've done a video talking about the Citizen titanium watch in there where it has an elevated scratch resistance from a coating that's on the outside. It sounds like the same type of thing here with this Traska, which isn't an entirely unique aspect, but then the downside's always, well, what happens if the coating wears off? I don't know. It depends on the coating, how well it bonds to the stainless steel. I'm not a coating expert, but in my business, we powder coat all our aluminum. I know a little bit about coatings, and I know that some of them have their advantages and disadvantages and longevity. And so all that is kind of a question, but while it is intact, the extra scratch resistance, especially for the price point, is always a great to have. It's something I'll really never complain about. I just don't know enough to really brag like crazy about it. So all in all, I think the watch is really a nice package, fantastic for the price point. Again, it's another micro brand. I've been talking a lot about them because not everyone can afford to buy, $7, $10, $20, $5,000 watches, or maybe even one. I remember when I used to save up for my Zen 104, which is the first watch over $1,000, and I felt like it was crazy to spend that money on it. A watch like this, I think, is a fantastic introduction into a higher price tier that gives you, really, you're starting to get to that tipping point where, spending the other $5,000 on something like this gives you only a little bit of extra feeling. Sure, there's other advancements here, and sure, the name and the, spring drive in the back has a lot of other advantages, but really, you're really hitting that inflection point where extra dollars isn't like a linear increase in quality. This is a fantastic package, really nice aesthetic, beautiful execution, and gives you a lot to really brag about as you're wearing it. So thanks to Traska for lending this in. If you guys have firsthand experience with the scratch resistance of Traska, please let everyone know in the comments below because you know better than I do. And if you have response from the customer service, stuff like that, obviously that's always good to know and good to leave for everyone else in the comments down below. Other than that, I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.